breathing. Something so common, so automatic, that few stop to observe. However, what if I told you that in the simple act of sighing lies one of the most sacred gestures repeated by Jesus in the most critical moments of his mission? Not as a reflex of fatigue, but as a hidden rite. 3 sighs, discreet, deep, loaded with intent. Most people have never noticed this pattern, let alone spotted it in the scriptures, but it's there, hidden in plain sight. And what if this pattern was not a coincidence, but a code? From ancient times, spiritual masters have used breathing as a direct channel to the divine. However, what few understand is that there are moments when this breath becomes sacred language. Jesus, considered by many as the greatest of masters, would never do something repeatedly on impulse. In his presence, every gesture was loaded with meaning, every silence, a teaching. So why would he sigh 3 times before acting in moments of healing, surrender, or revelation? Imagine this. In the pitch darkness of Gethsemane, on the verge of facing arrest, he steps away from his disciples, silences the world around him, and sighs. Before calling Lazarus back to life, he looks up to the sky and takes a deep breath, and in the final moment, on Golgotha, there is no cry, no despair, just a last sigh. But what if it wasn't just one? What if there were 3? It's this pattern we'll dive into today, and upon understanding it, perhaps you'll never breathe the same way again. Throughout history, many rituals have been concealed, others forgotten, and some deliberately silenced. There are practices so simple and powerful that, if made common, would give humans an uncontrollable spiritual autonomy. The rite of the 3 sighs may have been one of these, a gesture too simple to be noticed, yet too profound to be ignored. Upon careful observation, we realize that it carries something beyond the physical, an internal movement, a vibrational portal. The breath, since the beginning of traditions, is a symbol of origin. In Jewish mythology, God creates man and breathes into his nostrils the ruach, the breath of life. In ancient Greek, the term pneuma also translates to spirit and breath, and in the Aramaic spoken by Jesus, the word for spirit was equally used for wind and breath. Breathing has always been the bridge between the visible and the invisible, between the body and the soul, between the now and the eternal. So when a master like him sighs, is it the universe that exhales with him? Why 3? 3 is a number of integration: body, mind, and spirit. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Past, present, and future. The number 3 symbolizes wholeness. In many traditions, 3 is the number of manifestation. When Jesus sighs 3 times, he is not just breathing, he is sealing a process: perception, acceptance, transmutation, a complete cycle of surrender and reconnection. But what makes this rite even more intriguing is the way it has disappeared from modern Christian practice. It is not discussed in homilies. It is not taught in seminaries. The rite of the 3 sighs does not appear as doctrine, nor as technique, and yet it is there, subtle, discreet, threading through the Gospels like a golden line between the words. Perhaps because one does not teach something that must be felt. Perhaps because what is too sacred needs to be rediscovered from the inside out. Today we breathe superficially. We breathe in haste, anxiety, fear. But Jesus, in moments when everyone else would panic, breathed. Not just as a relief, but as a grounding gesture, an internal preparation, a wordless prayer. He didn't run away from the present moment. He absorbed it, and he did it through breath. An ancient knowledge that perhaps we have forgotten, but the body still recognizes. Modern science is beginning to prove what the ancients knew intuitively. Each mindful breath activates the parasympathetic system, reducing fear, restoring clarity, and accessing deeper layers of the self. But what if this is just the surface? What if, by sighing intentionally, repetitively, and ritualistically, we are not only changing the body, but also tuning the soul with subtler dimensions? The Rite of the Three Sighs may actually be a spiritual device, a mechanism for realignment with the source, and perhaps that's why it was practiced in silence, reserved only for those who could perceive its effects. But now, at this point in history, where humanity is seeking redefinition, it might be time to bring it to light. Not as a dogma, but as a living practice. Not as something external, but as something that has always been at our disposal. This is the invitation, to look within, to observe the invisible, to rediscover the power of something as subtle as the air that enters and exits our lungs. In the following chapters, we will explore the evidence, the forgotten texts, the hidden contexts where Jesus used this gesture. We will pull back the curtains of history, theology, and mysticism to decipher what may have been one of the greatest silent secrets of his journey. And at the end of this journey, you will not only understand the Rite of the Three Sighs, but you will be able to practice it, integrate it, and perhaps rediscover that sacred presence that has always guided you, even when everything seemed dark. Because sometimes what heals the most is what no one sees, but the heart feels. In the heart of the Gospels, there are words that shine and words that hide. Some jump out at you with miracles, parables, and resurrections. Others, however, whisper between the lines, like breath, sigh, breathing. They are fragile verbs, almost invisible, that escape the attention of those who read in a hurry. But when we approach with keen eyes, we realize that in moments of extreme spiritual importance, Jesus sighs. And this detail is not accidental. It is there as a subtle marker of something profound that is about to happen. In John 11:33, before Lazarus' tomb, the text says, Jesus, deeply moved, was disturbed in spirit. A few verses later, he groaned within himself. And this translation, from the original Greek embramaomai, may indicate a strong sigh, a breath of realignment, as if gathering invisible forces before manifesting something grand. And then, after this gesture, he calls Lazarus back to life. The sigh precedes the miracle. It is the invisible preparation of the invisible. There is yet another profoundly symbolic moment in John 20:22 after the resurrection, when Jesus encounters his disciples, and according to the text, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." It's not a metaphor, it's a physical act, charged with spiritual intention. He breathes, just as the Creator breathed into the clay of creation. He infuses, through his breath, a new state of consciousness. In this breath, there is initiation, transformation, rebirth. It's not by chance, it's a rite. The symbolism of the breath also appears in the most dramatic moment of all, the crucifixion. In Luke 23:46, it is written that Jesus cried out with a loud voice and then gave up the spirit. In John 19:30 he says, "It is finished." And then he bowed his head and gave up the spirit. Here, giving up the spirit is not just dying. It is exhaling something more, a final breath laden with mission, purpose, and sanctity. As if at that moment, he sealed not only his departure, but the transmission of a subtle teaching that few would understand. Scholars generally interpret these gestures as human expressions of emotion, sadness, compassion, exhaustion. But what happens if we look through a different lens, that of the symbolic and spiritual language that permeates all of Jesus' teachings? Could we not be facing a code, a repeated pattern executed with precision, pointing to an inner practice discreetly passed on to the initiated? It's worth noting that in Mark 7:34, when healing a deaf man with a speech impediment, Jesus looks up to the sky, sighs deeply, and says, "Ephphatha," which means "be opened." Here again, the respiratory gesture precedes the manifestation of the healing. It's not just a detail, it's a ritual. The sigh is what aligns the gesture with the divine. It's the seed of the word that will become reality. This pattern appears strongly, always before the action. And it's always three-dimensional. He observes, breathes, and acts. In the Hebrew oral tradition, words like neshama, soul, and neshama, breath, share the same root. The soul is the breath. and every profound teaching was conveyed not only with words, but with vibration, gesture, presence. The sigh in this context is pure spiritual language. It precedes speech because it is what gives speech its spiritual potency. Jesus, who mastered the codes of the unseen like no one else, seemed to use breath as a hidden device, almost a vibrational button that adjusted the frequency of action. In Kabbalah, for example, the name of God, YHWH, is considered untranslatable, but many mystics associate it with the sound of breathing, the inhalation being the Yodhi, the exhalation, the Vavhe. Hence, the name of God would be unconsciously pronounced every time we breathe. This completely alters our perception of life and the divine presence. Jesus was deeply familiar with the Jewish mystical tradition, and perhaps he translated it for his disciples into silent gestures like this. When we observe these breathing moments as windows to a lost teaching, the very structure of the gospel seems to change. What was invisible gains light. The sigh is not a coincidence. It is a marker of transition, an invitation to presence, a gesture pointing to something larger happening within before happening outside. And when this gesture is repeated 3 times in distinct contexts, as we will see, it's as if it's telling us, pay attention. This is where reality bends to the spirit. But why would this code have been hidden over time? Perhaps because it's too simple. Perhaps because it's too powerful. Or maybe because it cannot be systemized, sold, or controlled. The Rite of the Three Sighs, discreetly embedded in Jesus' actions, represents one of the purest spiritual tools, a form of direct tuning with the divine, without intermediaries, without external rituals, without dogmas, just presence and breath. The most intriguing thing is that, when reading the Gospels with this new perspective, the attentive reader may notice that there are more sighs than one might have imagined. Some are explicitly mentioned, others implied in contexts of silence and retreat. In all cases, there's a pattern. The sigh as a bridge, as a lever, as a catalyst. Jesus didn't breathe aimlessly. He sighed to activate, to heal, to surrender. And perhaps now, after centuries, we are ready to understand. The invitation, therefore, is this: reread the Gospels with a fresh perspective, not merely as text, but as a living spiritual practice. What was Jesus doing between one word and another? What happened in the silence between 2 gestures? What did that moment mean when he simply sighed? In the next chapter, we will dive deeper into the mystical traditions that preserved this knowledge, long before institutional theology, and far beyond it. When we observe Jesus' journey in the light of ancient traditions, we begin to notice something surprising. He did not teach in isolation, nor did he operate outside the spiritual context of his time. He was the apex of a long lineage of initiatory masters, heir to practices that date back to ancient Egypt, to Sumerian wisdom, to Hebrew mysticism, and even to Vedic meditation. Within this context, breathing was not a simple biological act, but a spiritual technology. And when we talk about 3 sighs, we are not just talking about repetition. We are talking about a structured rite, used for millennia as a mechanism to access different states of consciousness. Each sigh, a portal; each exhalation, a crossing; each cycle, a transformation. The number 3 has always been considered sacred in ancient cultures. In Egypt, it represented the divine trinity, Isis, Osiris, and Horus. In the Vedic tradition of India, there are 3 gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas, that constitute existence. In the Hebrew world, 3 letters initiate the most sacred names and structure the paths of the tree of life in Kabbalah. 3 is the number of creation and transcendence. Not by chance, many spiritual rituals require 3 repetitions, 3 knocks, 3 turns, 3 blessings. The 3-part breath, used by initiates, represents the mastery of time. Inhale the past, hold the present, exhale the future, and with this, escape from the prison of linearity to access the eternal. Among the Essenes, a mystical group that many scholars believe Jesus had contact with or even received training from, there were daily breathing practices linked to sunrise and sunset. These practices were not just hygienic, but deeply spiritual. The Essenes saw air as the vehicle of the Holy Spirit, literally the divine breath, and used rhythmic breaths to align themselves with the rhythms of the universe. Three sighs in this context could represent the three worlds: the lower world, unconscious and instinctive; the middle world, mind and emotion; and the upper world, spirit and transcendence. Breathing in three acts was like traversing an internal map of ascension. Other hidden traditions also carry this respiratory code. In Sufism, the whirling dervishes use conscious breathing in conjunction with spinning movement to transcend duality and achieve union with the divine. During the spin, there is a precise breathing pattern, often divided into three parts: short inhalation, deep retention, gentle exhalation, used to open the heart and dissolve the ego. Taoists also divide breathing into three levels: abdominal, thoracic, and cranial. Each level corresponds to an energy center that needs to be activated for energy to flow freely between heaven and earth. In the Gnostic texts, such as the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, we find veiled mentions of internal practices that involve silence, focus, and breathing. Many of these instructions are not explicit but intuited. There are phrases like, "When the soul inhales deeply, it will recognize the voice of the Father," or "What lives in you breathes with you, and when you breathe with intent, He manifests." Here, the sigh is no longer a human gesture. It becomes the signature of the divine acting through the body. Three sighs would therefore be three conscious invocations of the sacred presence. A fascinating point is that, in all these traditions, the sigh appears as a response to revelation. It's not a casual gesture, but a form of energetic digestion. The initiate breathes to assimilate, to transmute, to prepare the inner ground, and only then they act. This is the same pattern we see in Jesus: silence, sigh, manifestation. In other words, there's an invisible ritualistic process that repeats itself, and it only reveals itself to those who observe with spiritual attention, not just with the eyes, but with an awakened soul. Another recurring symbol in these ancient schools is the triangle, and the triangle in turn is a breathing map. The lower vertex represents inhalation, receiving. The right vertex is retention, assimilation. The left vertex is exhalation, giving. When we breathe in three conscious stages, we recreate within us the same triangle that forms the pyramids, the six-pointed stars, the eyes of wisdom. We are, symbolically, drawing within the body the temple where the divine dwells. The Rite of Three Sighs can therefore be seen as the activation of this inner temple. We must not forget that, for the ancients, the human body was the true altar. There was no need for external temples when one knew how to breathe correctly. This is because the air that enters is not just oxygen. It is subtle energy, referred to as prana, chi, pneuma, or ruach, depending on the tradition. Jesus seems to have reclaimed this forgotten truth and used it with simplicity and depth without drawing attention to himself. He breathed with the Father, and in doing so, he showed the way back home, without maps, without dogmas, just with the body, silence, and air. This type of practice, although seemingly simple, requires a refined mind and a heart free of haste. Most people want ready-made formulas, external rituals, and immediate results. But breathing, and especially sighing, teaches patience, listening, and surrender. Perhaps for this reason, this knowledge has been lost. It demands an inner surrender that cannot be sold, cannot be taught with words, only transmitted through presence and example, just like Jesus did. And what does this tell us about the Rite of the Three Sighs? That it may not just be a practice, but a passage, a way to traverse worlds, to align body, mind, and spirit into a single gesture. And that by repeating this gesture with awareness, the practitioner reconnects with an invisible lineage of masters, prophets, mystics, and seekers. Three sighs may seem like little until you do them with intention. And then something changes. You feel it, not outside, but within. In the upcoming layers of this journey, we'll see how Jesus applied this rite in specific events and why. Not as a performance, but as a sacred tool. And perhaps as we better understand these contexts, we may recognize that the gateways are still here, just waiting for someone to breathe 3 times with an awakened soul. In moments when the fate of humanity seemed to hang by an invisible thread, Jesus did not run, did not rush, did not scream in despair. He sighed. This observation, though subtle at first glance, becomes powerful when we revisit the texts with a deeper listening. Each sigh recorded in the scriptures not only marks an emotion, but a transition, a turning point between the human and the divine. It's not just about sadness or compassion, it's about activation. And when we observe the most intense and crucial moments of Jesus' life, we realize that the sigh repeats itself, like a spiritual echo of something sacred happening. In the episode of Lazarus's tomb, for example, we find one of the most explicit records of this gesture. John writes that Jesus was deeply moved and shortly after, groaned within himself. This expression, when translated from the original Greek, refers to an intense exhalation, a deliberate and audible release. The master was not merely moved, he was in a state of preparation. Death had dominated that space. But Jesus, before uttering any word, before crying out, "Lazarus, come out," Log performed a sigh. Not just one, but with clear indications that this gesture was reiterated, internally and externally, as if he were adjusting to a frequency that precedes the miracle. Another pivotal moment is the account in Mark 7:34, when Jesus encounters a man who is deaf and has speech difficulties. Faced with such a condition, any common healer would act hastily. But Jesus lifts his eyes to the heavens, breathes deeply, here explicitly described as a sigh, and only then does he say, "Ephphatha," which means, "be opened." Here is the pattern again: alignment, breath, manifestation. The speech that creates comes after the sigh that silences. The gesture is not a mere prelude. It is the fertile field where the word gains strength and destiny. There is also an extraordinary detail in the account of John 20:22, where, already resurrected, Jesus appears to the disciples, and instead of giving them theological instructions or making a heavenly demonstration, he simply breathes on them and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit." This breath, charged with the same symbolism as the creative breath of Genesis, is an energy transfer. It is the breath that initiates a new era in their consciousness. The gesture is direct, intimate, penetrating, a breath that contains within it all the weight of the resurrection, all the fire of spiritual initiation. Here, there is no doubt. The sigh is a channel, it is a bridge, it is a transmission. However, no moment is more laden with symbolism than the crucifixion. The evangelists record that Jesus, in giving his last breath, gave up the spirit. In Mark, this is stated even more clearly. Jesus let out a loud cry and expired. But if we go back to the original Aramaic, the verb used can be interpreted as a continuous release, a phased breath. And what if, instead of just one last breath, he had taken 3? One for the body, one for the mind, one for the spirit. Each one, releasing a level of his existence, like peeling off layer by layer until returning to the source. And more. In Gethsemane, even before the arrest, we find Jesus distancing himself from the disciples to pray. The text says that he prostrates with his face to the ground, prays in silence, and returns to the disciples 3 times. Each time he returns, they are asleep. With each departure, he delves deeper into himself. Although the text does not directly state that he sighed during these moments, there is a strong suggestion of withdrawal, of profound introspection, and this is precisely the condition in which the ritual sigh arises, not as a gesture of relief, but as a catalyst for presence, for focus, for surrender. These key moments are not a coincidence. They form a map, a respiratory path of spiritual manifestation through the body. Jesus didn't use the sigh as a vent, but as a device. Each sigh precedes an act of power, a healing, a surrender, a resurrection, It's as if he was saying without words, "Prepare yourselves, something is about to happen." And indeed, it happens, because the sigh precedes the word, and the word, in his case, creates realities. Interestingly, in various post-resurrection appearances, Jesus appears in the center of an environment, and the first reaction is silence. He looks, he waits. In many of these descriptions, the atmosphere is of suspension, as if something had been breathed into that space. The absence of a description of the gesture does not mean absence of the gesture, but perhaps an indication that it had become so integrated that it no longer needed to be mentioned. The Master had become the very sigh. Jesus' breathing was not merely biological, it was vibrational. Each breath was a realignment with the Father's will, a harmony with universal intelligence. Therefore, he did not act out of balance. He acted with precision. When he sighed, it was as if he was reading the invisible movements of reality, and then, at the right moment, he put himself into action. He was a living oracle, and his breath was his channel for reading and responding. This pattern is more than symbolic, it's replicable. And perhaps that's why it has remained hidden, passed on only from master to disciple, from heart to heart. You don't teach intentional sighing in a homily. You teach it through example, with presence, with direct experience. And that's why this ritual stays alive. Because it doesn't need written record, just someone who breathes with awareness. Now, having glimpsed how the rite of the three sighs appeared at key moments, we may ask ourselves, how does this gesture connect with other traditions that also used breath as a sacred technology? And how did it survive, even hidden, among those who never stopped seeking? That's what we'll see in the next stage of this journey, where Jesus' breath echoes in age-old practices of other cultures, revealing that the divine, after all, breathes everywhere. Humanity has always sought the divine outside of itself, in temples, in mountains, in distant stars. But the great masters throughout the centuries pointed in another direction, inward. And within the human body, there was an access point as intimate as it was powerful, the breath. Unlike any other physiological function, it is at the same time automatic and voluntary, unconscious and conscious, earthly and sacred. This duality makes it unique, an internal mechanism that can be used as spiritual technology. Not as a metaphor, but as a real tool for transformation and elevation. And Jesus, with his disarming simplicity, seems to have mastered this science with a naturalness that escaped theological eyes and silently penetrated the souls of those who still seek today. Breathing, when done with attention and intention, instantly alters the body's chemistry. Modern studies show that practices like diaphragmatic breathing activate the parasympathetic system, decrease cortisol levels, increase heart rate variability, and generate states of near meditative presence. However, what science is just beginning to understand, the ancients already knew, not through graphs or tests, but through direct and profound experience. Eastern masters, forest shamans, desert monks, they all converged on the same point. Whoever masters breathing, masters themselves, and whoever masters themselves can touch the eternal. In the Hindu tradition, we find pranayama, the control of vital energy through breath. Prana is not just air, it's subtle force. It's life in its purest form. Breathing, therefore, is channeling prana. Not breathing with awareness is wasting it. In some methods, the breathing cycle is divided into 4 parts: inhalation, retention, exhalation, and emptiness. Each corresponds to a state of being. By mastering this cycle, the practitioner learns to quiet the mind, purify the body, and access states of deep meditation. Jesus, who traveled among cultures and transcended spiritual boundaries, surely came into contact with this science, and may have translated this knowledge through his own gestures, through his own sighs. Taoists also developed refined breathing techniques based on the circulation of qi, the vital energy. They believed that correct breathing moves the qi through the meridians, unlocking organs, clearing repressed emotions, and opening spiritual channels. Breathing, in this context, is literally internal alchemy. It transforms the dense into the subtle, chaos into clarity, suffering into wisdom. And here, the number 3 appears again. The three dantians, energy centers located in the abdomen, the heart, and the brain, that can be activated with specific breathing practices. 3 centers, 3 sighs, 3 portals. In Sufism, conscious breathing is an essential part of zikr, the constant remembrance of God. Each inhalation is an invocation, each exhalation a surrender. Sufis assert that by breathing with divine intention, the practitioner dissolves the separation between creator and creature. Here, there is no theology, there is experience, there is presence. Jesus, with his direct connection to the Father and his deep silent compassion, seems to have lived in this same state of remembrance. When he sighed, perhaps he was remembering who he was, and with that, inviting us to remember as well. Even the Native Americans, without scriptures or formal systems, understood that breathing connected man with the Great Spirit. In ceremonies like the sweat lodge or in fasting vision practices, breath was used to expand the senses and cross the veils of the visible world. The Celts, the Druids, the Siberian shamans all used breath to traverse realms. It was Ariadne's thread in the labyrinth of existence. Breath as a guide, the sigh as a rite. Within the Hebrew tradition, breath was intimately linked to the unpronounceable name of God. Many mystics taught that YHWH is not to be read, but to be breathed. The inhale would be the Yod-He, and the exhale the Vav-He. God's name would thus be the natural sound of life. Jesus, as a Jewish mystic and deep connoisseur of these traditions, would have embodied this knowledge. His sigh was not just a sound, it was a living prayer, a silent remembrance of the One. And even deeper, breathing is the only link between all human beings. Before we even have beliefs, cultures, or words, we all breathe, and we all sigh. The sigh comes spontaneously in moments of truth, pure emotion, surrender. It cannot be fabricated. It comes from the soul. Perhaps that's why it's so powerful as a spiritual tool, because it's simple, human, universal, and at the same time divine. Jesus knew this, and for that reason, his practice was accessible, without the need for temples, priests, or elaborate ceremonies. It was enough to stop, feel, and sigh 3 times. Calling breathing technology may sound strange to modern ears, accustomed to chips and circuits, but technology is, at its core, an organized method of producing transformation, and that's exactly what the Rite of the Three Sighs proposes: an organized way to traverse states, to access wisdom, to realign internal chaos. By sighing with intention, you reboot your system, physical, emotional, spiritual. And when this is repeated with consciousness, the miracle ceases to be a promise and becomes a consequence. Science is beginning to achieve this understanding. Neuroscientists have identified that controlled breathing activates areas of the brain responsible for emotional self-regulation, empathy, and the feeling of connection to something greater. In experiments with monks, mystics, and meditators, it has been shown that certain breathing patterns induce states of enlightenment. But for those who have been practicing this for millennia, these confirmations are just the echo of something always known. Breathing is the language that the body understands and that the soul speaks, when we give it space. Therefore, what Jesus did with his sighs was much more than an emotional gesture. It was a precise act, an activation, a silent transmission. By sighing before acting, he showed the way. First breathe, then speak. First align yourself, then act. First return to the center, then walk. This is the map he left us. Not drawn on papyrus, but imprinted in the flesh, in the breath, in the presence. A map that always reveals itself at the moment we decide to stop and breathe. Amid the deserts of history, there are seeds that do not die. They do not bloom under the spotlights, nor do they spread in official books, but they rest in the folds of time, in the practices of silent monks, in the marginal annotations of forbidden manuscripts, in the discreet gestures of seekers who refuse to forget. The Rite of the Three Sighs is one of these seeds, never formalized, never taught out loud, but always practiced by those who knew how to listen to the invisible. And in tracing the footsteps of this practice, we find powerful echoes in traditions that survived the censorship of empires, the rigidity of religions, and the noise of the ages. Among the Desert Fathers, Christian hermits who isolated themselves in the dunes of Egypt in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, there are reports of meditative practices that involved long periods of silence and conscious breathing. Many of these monks, considered pre-mystics of Christianity, described in their records experiences of unification with God through the inner repetition of the name and deep rhythmic breathing. Evagrius Ponticus, one of the most influential, taught that true prayer only happened when the mind descended into the heart. And this, according to him, occurred through controlled breath, where the name of Jesus was synchronized with the respiratory flow. A clear echo, albeit veiled, of breathing as a rite of spiritual ascension. Already in the monasteries of Mount Athos in Greece, where for centuries the hesychast practice developed in secret, the pattern repeats itself. Hesychia, or prayer of the heart, is not a common verbal repetition. It is a complete technique of breathing and focus. The monks teach to inhale slowly while visualizing Lord Jesus Christ, hold with attention on Son of God, and exhale with, have mercy on me. This sequence, when performed with awareness, generates deep states of quietude and enlightenment. And although the teaching is simple, the masters warn, only through the sigh of the soul does the name reveal itself fully. Breathing, silence, surrender. Again, 3 sacred acts. In the Middle East, there are nearly forgotten manuscripts from the Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945, which reveal fragments of early Gnostic spirituality. In these texts, such as the Gospel of Thomas and the Book of Thomas, the Twin, there are indirect mentions of practices of elevation by breath, expansion through the silence of the soul, and 3 phases of opening to the Father. At no point do these texts directly describe the breathing rite, but the symbolic pattern is there, hidden beneath the mystical language, a gesture that repeats, a cycle that completes, a journey that begins with the breath and ends in union with the light. It's as if the authors wrote in codes, leaving clues only for the eyes that breathe with the soul. Interestingly, we find parallels in esoteric Christian communities of the Middle Ages. The Bogomils in the Balkan region and the Cathars in the south of France spoke of the breath of God as a living force, present within every human being. For them, true communion did not occur in bread or wine, but in the shared breath. Some accounts state that before any ritual, the more initiated members practiced 3 slow breaths in unison, in absolute silence, as a way to cleanse the inner temple. No theoretical explanation was given. The gesture was self-explanatory, transmitted by the body, not by words. In the Islamic world, the Sufi current preserved breathing traditions with astonishing similarity. Ibn Arabi, the great Andalusian mystic of the 12th century, described in his texts that the universe is the sigh of God, and that by breathing with purity, we can align ourselves with this eternal sigh. His disciples practiced breathings in groups of 3 cycles, accompanied by silent invocations. The goal? To dissolve the ego and inhabit the absolute now. This triad, breathing, invocation, dissolution, shows that, far beyond words, the practice was perpetuated in the bodies of those who dared to touch the divine. Even in lesser-known Christian traditions, such as 17th-century Quaker mysticism, there are accounts of breathed silences during services. The members would sit in a circle, and before any verbal expression, they would practice what they called listening to the breath of the Spirit. Some documents suggest that upon sensing the divine presence, people would take 3 deep sighs, almost as if they were acknowledging the presence of the sacred. The gesture was not taught, but emerged spontaneously, 1 sigh to quiet the mind, another to open the heart, and a 3rd to allow the action of the Spirit. The most fascinating thing is that, in none of these traditions, we find the rite of the 3 sighs formalized as doctrine. And this may be exactly what kept it alive. By not being imprisoned in liturgies or catechisms, it escaped institutionalization and remained a free, fluid, secret, and effective practice. It survived because it was simple. It persisted because it was direct. It was passed from chest to chest, from breath to breath, through monks, wanderers, anonymous mothers, forgotten healers. And so, what seemed lost was merely sleeping. In recent centuries, with the advancement of rationality and spiritual fragmentation, this type of practice has been relegated to marginal mysticism. Yet, some seekers continued to record their experiences. Modern mystics such as Thomas Merton, Teresa of Calcutta, and even contemporary authors report moments of profound spiritual clarity accompanied by a sigh. They do not call it a rite, nor do they attempt to explain it, but whenever they connect deeply, something in their body releases air with reverence. And this gesture, untaught, unrationalized, is what connects them with the invisible lineage of those who breathe with the eternal. Today, looking back and connecting all these dots, we realize that there is an underground thread linking Essenes, Hesychasts, Gnostics, Sufis, Cathars, and seekers of all ages. This thread is the breath. More precisely, the sigh. And even more deeply, the gesture repeated 3 times with intention and reverence. The Rite of the Three Sighs, although it has no name or manual, is a practice that has spanned millennia, preserved not in libraries, but in the hearts of the awakened. And now, at this point in our journey, the inevitable question arises. What would it be like then to perform this rite consciously? How is it done? Is there a correct way, a sequence, an intention? In the next stage, we will delve into the revelation of the technique, not as a magic formula, but as a mirror of something you already do, only you may have forgotten how to feel it. There are gestures that cannot be explained, only experienced. There are practices so simple that their depth is frightening because they break the idea that the sacred must be complex. The Rite of the Three Sighs is not a technique that you learn as if memorizing a step-by-step. It's a key that turns from within. A reminder, a bridge between what you are now and what you've always been. Throughout the last parts, we walk through the roots, contexts, and manifestations of this sacred gesture. Now finally it's time to reveal, with the same simplicity with which Jesus practiced it, what constitutes the Rite of the Three Sighs in its living and transformative essence. The first thing we need to understand is that this rite is not intended to manipulate the external world. It is not done to attract blessings, results, miracles, or visions. It is, above all, a form of realignment, a return to inner order, a reunion with the all-pervading presence. It's not about controlling, but allowing. It's not about conquering, but making room. And for this reason, it must be done in a state of total surrender. What activates the rite is not the posture nor the perfection of the breath, it's the intention, the purity of surrender. The Rite of the Three Sighs can be performed anywhere, at any time, without the need for an altar, incense, or instruments. But if possible, a quiet environment is preferable. It begins with the calming of the mind, eyes closed, spine erect, hands at rest. The body should be present but without rigidity. The initial focus is just to feel the body as it is. Don't force anything. Don't change anything. Just observe. Allow the breath to happen on its own for a few moments, like listening to a river before crossing it. And so begins the first sigh. This initial sigh is for the body. It should be deep, slow, felt from the abdomen to the top of the lungs. Inhale as if you're receiving the entire world, and exhale as if you're releasing the weight of 1,000 years. This sigh releases tensions, physical fears, the accumulations of the day. Upon exhaling, it's essential to let go of everything, the rush, the control, the pains. The body prepares to become a channel. Nothing else needs to be carried. Everything can be let go. Here begins the cleansing of the temple. The second sigh is for the mind. It should be quieter, more subtle. Inhale attentively, as if welcoming all ideas, judgments, thoughts, and upon exhaling, dissolve them into space. This is the sigh of humility, of acknowledging that we don't know, that we can rest from the effort of understanding everything. As the air is released, the practitioner lets go of the internal narrative, the noise, the demand to be right. It's like blowing dust off a mirror. The mind, for the first time, falls silent, not because it has been dominated, but because it has been embraced. The third sigh is for the spirit. It is the softest, the most delicate, the most sacred. To inhale with reverence, as if receiving a kiss from the unseen, and to exhale with devotion, as if returning life to the Creator itself. This sigh has no shape, nor purpose. It is a gesture of pure love, an act of fusion. Here there is no more separation. The practitioner is no longer doing anything, just being. It is in this third sigh that the miracle can happen. And it can manifest as silence, as peace, as a tear, or as a simple emptiness filled with presence. The sequence can be repeated as many times as necessary, but the most powerful way is to do it once a day with total awareness, not as a habit, but as a ritual. Over time, the body begins to recognize this pattern as a portal. At the first sigh, it relaxes. At the second, it quiets. At the third, it opens. There are reports of people who, after a few weeks of practicing, began to notice a sense of silent communion, something unexplainable, but real. Others describe subtle healings, changes in perception, profound dreams. But everyone agrees on one thing. Once you experience it, something changes forever. It's important to understand that the Rite of the Three Sighs does not replace any tradition, faith, or spiritual practice. It can be incorporated into any path. It can be performed before a prayer, at the end of a meditation, upon waking, or before sleeping. It simply intensifies what is already present, like a lens that focuses on the sacred, and for some, it becomes the path itself, not because of its complexity, but because of the truth that reveals itself in the simple gesture. The greatest risk of this practice is superficiality, of turning it into a formula, of repeating it soullessly. Therefore, it is essential to remember, each sigh is unique, each moment is unrepeatable, and what activates the rite is an open heart. It's the sincere willingness to meet. Don't seek effects, don't expect answers, just sigh, and let what is true reveal itself. The Rite of the Three Sighs is not a technique. It's a communion, a bridge between what you think you are and what you truly are. In the experience of some seekers, there is a clear sensation that this gesture reconnects with something ancient, as if the body knew the way, even before the mind understood. Some report that, when they perform the three sighs with intention, they feel as if they are responding to a silent call, coming from far away, or from deep within, as if in that moment they were breathing with Jesus, not the Jesus of history, but the Jesus of living presence, the inner master. And perhaps that's exactly it. The Rite of the Three Sighs is not about imitating a master, but about rediscovering the master who breathes within each of us. When Jesus sighed, he wasn't just aligning himself with God. He was showing a path without words, without explanations, without the need for belief, a path that anyone can follow, because everyone breathes, but few breathe with the soul. Now that the technique has been revealed, that the gesture has been etched into your body through words, the journey can enter another dimension, the dimension of the fruits. What happens to those who practice? What changes in the day-to-day, in relationships, in decisions? What kind of silent transformation begins to sprout when someone breathes with intention? This is what we will reveal in the next step, the invisible fruits of practice. Because a sigh changes everything, but not on the outside. It changes first where no one can see. There are changes that make no noise. They don't arrive with applause, with announcements, with spiritual fireworks. They sprout like the morning dew, discreet yet profound. Such are the fruits of the Rite of Three Sighs. Unlike techniques that promise immediate results or spectacular transformations, this practice works from within, invisibly, like a breeze that cleans the dark corridors of the soul. And when you least expect it, you realize that something has changed. Your way of seeing, of feeling, of reacting. Your way of being alive. One of the first transformations reported by practitioners is the spontaneous return to the present moment, not as a concept or ideal, but as an experienced reality. After a few days of practice, many people describe a state of quietness that sets in even amidst chaos. As if upon sighing 3 times, time slows down. Breathing then becomes an anchor, a silent axis that prevents emotional collapse. Fear loses strength. Anxiety dissolves without a fight. The body comes home, the mind disarms, and the soul smiles. Another common fruit is inner clarity. Not that cold, rational mental clarity, but a clarity that comes from the heart, as if a fog had dissipated and you finally see with the right eyes. Decisions that were once difficult become simple. Intuition strengthens. There's a kind of silent intelligence that begins to guide your steps, and you start to realize that many of the answers you were seeking outside were waiting for you inside. All you had to do was sigh and listen. On an emotional level, the ritual of the 3 sighs acts as a healing catalyst. People who have been living with deep sorrows, unprocessed grief, or old guilt report that over the weeks, they began to feel an inexplicable lightness. It's not that the pain disappears as if by magic, it is embraced. And in this embrace, it is transformed. The sigh, as it passes through the lungs, seems to carry not only oxygen, but compassion. And this compassion, as it circulates through the chest, softens the scars and restores the power to love. Abundance, so sought after and so misunderstood, also manifests in unexpected ways, not necessarily as money or possessions, but as flow. People report that doors begin to open, opportunities arise, meaningful encounters occur, old blockages dissolve. This is not because the sigh attracts something magical, but because it aligns the practitioner with their essence. And essence is naturally abundant. Where there is presence, there is flow. Where there is flow, there is provision. The sigh does not create wealth. It reveals the place within you that is already prosperous. In the dimension of relationships, the fruits are even more subtle and transformative. Couples in conflict report reconnection. Parents and children rediscover their gaze. Dormant friendships are reborn. This is because the sigh clears silent communication. It dissolves invisible tensions. When you breathe with intention, you send a message to the world. I am here, whole. And the world responds. The other, previously perceived as a threat or obstacle, becomes a mirror and ally. Breathing, as incredible as it may seem, restores the invisible thread of empathy. In the deepest accounts, there are experiences of transcendence. People who practice the Rite of the 3 sighs for months or years describe states of unity, moments where the sensation of separation completely dissolves. There is no longer me and the world. There is only being, the now, the all. Some call this divine presence. Others, radiant emptiness. Few attempt to explain. All agree on one thing: it's real. And this state is not induced by effort or elaborate technique. It simply emerges, like a flower blooming silently. The sigh is the fertile ground where the ineffable manifests. Interestingly, many also report a refinement of perception. Sounds previously ignored become melodies. Light seems brighter, touch more subtle, food more flavorful. There is a re-enchantment of life. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. This is because the sigh removes the layers of indifference accumulated by the excess of stimulation and haste. When you breathe with your soul, everything around you seems to breathe along. And in this echo, gratitude is born, not as an obligation, but as a natural response to the beauty of existence. Some people, especially those undergoing therapeutic or physical healing processes, report significant improvements. This is not about claiming miraculous cures, but recognizing that the body, when consciously receiving oxygen, activates its regenerative mechanisms. The immune system strengthens, chronic pain lessens, sleep deepens, digestion improves, and more profoundly, the body begins to be treated not as a faulty machine, but as a sacred temple. And every temple responds to care with silent blessings. At a spiritual level, perhaps the most beautiful of fruits is the reconnection with the mystery. The Rite of 3 sighs doesn't answer existential questions. It silences the noise that prevents hearing the answer that was already there. God, the universe, the source, call it what you will, doesn't need to shout. It whispers. And the sigh, by calming the waves of the mind, allows one to hear this whisper. Practitioners say they feel a sense of being guided, of receiving insights, of trusting more in the flow of life. Not because everything becomes clear, but because trust settles in, even in the dark. And finally, there is a fruit that cannot be measured, the lightness of being. A lightness that does not deny pain, but walks with it. That doesn't need to conquer the world, because it has already found a home within one's own chest. This lightness is not the absence of problems, it is the presence of meaning. It is knowing deeply that each step, each encounter, each challenge can be breathed, and thus transformed. The Rite of the Three Sighs doesn't change the world outside, but it changes the world you carry within. And when that world changes, everything changes. Now, having seen the invisible fruits of this living practice, only one question remains. What did Jesus want to show us with this simple, repeated, silent gesture? What was he teaching us, not with words, but with breath? In the last part of our itinerary, we will close this journey with the heart and with a call. Because perhaps, what he most wanted to teach us was never said, just sighed. There are moments when knowledge is not enough, when arguments are no longer necessary, when evidence falls silent and what remains is the call, not the one that screams, but the one that pulses in the chest, a subtle beat, a wind that blows from within to the outside, a gentle echo of eternity. We have come this far by following the trails of the invisible. We followed Jesus' sigh as if following footprints of light in a field of shadows. And now, on the threshold of this journey, the most truthful question emerges. Are you ready to remember, ready to breathe again, as he breathed? For centuries, the figure of Jesus has been exalted, deified, set apart, transformed into dogma, institution, a symbol of distant worship. But what if, for a moment, you could see him not as an unreachable icon, but as an older brother, a guide who walked this same ground, who felt pain, doubt, fear, and yet chose to breathe. Breathe with presence, with intention, with love, not to escape life, but to merge with it. And in this simple gesture, perhaps he left us his purest, most accessible, most transformative teaching. Imagine for a moment the world we live in today, a world of haste, screens, distractions, a world where almost no one breathes consciously, where silence has been replaced by noise, where the soul has been exiled by the logic of ceaseless doing. In this scenario, a sigh becomes an act of resistance, a revolutionary gesture, because when you sigh with presence, you interrupt the illusion. You regain control, you tear the veil of superficiality and touch the eternity that lives within you. To breathe as Jesus breathed is, today, a sacred act of return. This return does not demand perfection. It does not require creeds, diplomas, or spiritual certificates. It asks for only one thing: willingness. Willingness to stop, to listen to one's own heart, to accept the beauty and fragility of human life. Jesus, in his sighs, was not seeking glory, he was seeking the Father, and in doing so he found everything. He taught us, without saying, that breathing is the path to reconnection, that we don't need to climb mountains or traverse deserts. Just inhale with truth and exhale with surrender. 3 times, and everything changes. To breathe as Jesus breathed is to remember that each moment is an altar, that each encounter is a chance to give of oneself, that each challenge is a hidden initiation. He did not teach us to escape pain, but to traverse it with faith. And the sigh was his way of steadying his step before the leap. It was the prayer before the word. It was the silent pact with the presence. And this pact is still available. Now, here, in the next breath. It doesn't matter who you are, what you believe, or where you've been. The air does not discriminate. The spirit does not separate. It simply blows for anyone willing to receive. This invitation is not just symbolic, it's real, literal, and it begins now. The moment you, who are listening to me, close your eyes, rest your body, and decide to breathe. The practice has been revealed, the fruits have been shown, the testimonies have echoed. But nothing, absolutely nothing, can replace direct experience. The truth is not in words, but in the sigh that you yourself make, in the way you choose to stop in the midst of chaos and say, without voice, I have returned, I remember. Each sigh is a yes to life, a yes to the sacred, a yes to the Christ who breathes in you. And by doing so, you not only find peace, you become peace. And this transforms the world. A being that breathes consciously is like a lit candle in a dark room. They don't need to preach, convince, argue. Their presence is the light itself. And so effortlessly, others begin to breathe too. And the flame spreads, and the sigh becomes a collective prayer, a silent symphony of awakened souls, reconnected, present. All of this, starting with 3 breaths. Perhaps now you understand why this gesture was kept in silence. Because it wasn't indoctrinated. Because it didn't become a sacrament. It was too free, too simple, too powerful. Jesus knew that one day, in a time of collective exhaustion and hunger for truth, people would rediscover this gesture, and in doing so, they would be reborn. That's why he just sighed. He knew that one day someone would understand. He knew that one day you would get here. The return is not a place, it's a state, a way of being, an internal space where everything is clear, even without explanation. Breathing as Jesus breathed is to walk with an open heart. It's to see the other with compassion. It's to listen to oneself without fear. It's not to rush. It's to live each breath as a sacrament. It's to remember that the divine presence is not in the heights. It's in the chest, in the silence, in the sigh. 3 times. Always 3. So that the body, mind, and spirit may embrace again. At this moment, you already have everything you need. You're not carrying theory. You're carrying practice. You're not carrying belief. You're carrying experience. And now, the subtle yet immense responsibility is yours. You can forget. You can procrastinate. You can doubt. But the call has already been made. The memory has been activated. And it will not be silenced. With every moment of pain, the body will remember. With every moment of despair, your chest will crave air. And you will know, just sigh 3 times. And there, you'll be back. So with all love and reverence, I conclude this script with an invitation, not mine, but his, from the master who didn't yell, but lived, who didn't write books, but breathed miracles, who didn't leave us dogmas, but gestures, and among them, perhaps the most sacred, the Rite of the 3 sighs. If you've listened up to this point, it's because something in you has already breathed differently, and that will never be forgotten. Before you go, share with us in the comments. At what point in your life did you feel most that a simple sigh changed everything? Or, have you ever tried breathing with intention, as if you were conversing with the divine itself? Write down your testimony or your question below, not just for you, but because your experience could be exactly what someone needed to read today. Here at Minds Unfettered, each comment is part of a collective field of expression. When you write from the heart, you anchor this energy into the world. Together, we are creating a sacred space of awakening. And if you felt that something awakened in you during this video, then you need to continue this journey. Click on the video next to this right now. The Brotherhood of Light, the secret knowledge of Jesus that history erased. There, you will discover that Jesus's sighs were not just gestures. They were codes of a hidden lineage, connected to a millennial brotherhood that history tried to erase. But the light always finds a way to shine again. Minds Unfettered is waiting for you there. We are just getting started, and the next breath can change everything.